Welcome to Weekly News Highlights. The Cabinet held its extraordinary session at El Sif Palace, headed by His Highness Sheikh Sabah Khalid Hamad Al Sabah, the Prime Minister, with the focus mainly on combating the new COVID-19 virus. The Cabinet reviewed recommendations by the Ministerial Committee meetings in charge of following up the consequences of the emergence of the novel virus and issued several decisions based on them. More details with Sheikh Al-Tamimi.
The Cabinet held its extraordinary session at Al Sif Palace yesterday, headed by His Highness Sheikh Sabah Khalid Hamad Al Sabah, the Prime Minister, with the focus mainly on combating the new coronavirus, COVID-19. At the beginning of the meeting, His Highness the Premier conveyed His Highness the Emir Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmad Al-Jaber Al-Sabah and His Highness the Crown Prince Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmad Al-Jaber Al-Sabah's appreciation to all participating in the state efforts to combat the spread of the new coronavirus. Minister of Health Sheikh Dr. Basil Hamoud Hamad Al-Sabah briefed the Council on the latest developments on the global spread of the virus and also stated that contracts are underway with neighboring countries to coordinate on all precautionary measures taken regarding this issue. In the context of implementing plans to limit the spread of the emerging coronavirus, the Cabinet reviewed recommendations by the Ministerial Committee handling the state efforts against COVID-19 and decided to assign the Public Authority of Industry to coordinate with the relevant government and private sector agencies to take the necessary measures towards increasing production capacity of masks and sterilization materials to provide the strategic reserve need of these products. The Cabinet also called on Kuwait's supply company to continue with its efforts towards providing 30 million masks from different markets and assigned the Ministry of Social Affairs to instruct the consumer cooperative associations to distribute masks to appropriate pharmacy branches and sales centers and to be sold to all consumers at a price of no more than 100 fils per mask. The Council of Ministers also warned all parties involved to not issue any instruction or take any measure related to antivirus efforts unless they are approved by the Ministerial Committee handling the state efforts against COVID-19. The Cabinet assigned the Ministry of Finance to coordinate with all state bodies to cover financial needs to combat the spread of the virus, as well as costs of logistical urgently needed services. The Council also assigned a committee headed by the General Secretariat of the Council of Ministers and the membership of both the Ministry of Finance and the Civil Service Bureau to submit appropriate proposals to financially honor those who work directly in implementing procedures to counter the spread of the virus and a show of appreciation to their sacrifices and risks. The Cabinet also reviewed recommendations mentioned in the committee's minutes regarding the implications of the instruction issued by the Civil Aviation Authority regarding imposing a polymerized chain reaction PCR examination on all arrivals from certain countries. In a view of the inability of some countries to implement the procedures and examinations for technical reasons, the Cabinet decided to entrust the Civil Aviation Authority to halt the implementation of the circular and provide practical alternatives that guarantee that travelers coming to the country are free from the virus as soon as possible. And finally, in order to preserve the strategic stockpile of masks, disinfection and sterilization materials, the Cabinet decided to assign the Ministry of Trade and Industry, in cooperation with the Ministry of Health, to set limits to the private sector on how to sell such materials according to approved regulations that do not minimize the strategic stockpile required by these articles.
The World Health Organization said all countries should make containing the outbreak of COVID-19 their top priority. The UN agency stressed that fighting the pandemic requires countries to work together and praised Iran for switching on to COVID-19 outbreak there and taking a fresh all-of-government approach. WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus told reporters at a briefing the pandemic is geographically expanding and deeply concerning. He added that WHO continuing to recommend all countries make containment their highest priority. Under the title, The Stakes of Peace and War, in Diplomacy, Anthropology, Climate and Conflict Science, POHAS organized its annual collaboration with KFAS under its Kuwait program. A two-day conference that tackled issues like COVID-19, climate change, diplomatic urgencies and Middle Eastern affairs like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. More is the following with Farah Al-Hashim.
Under the title The Stakes of Peace and War in Diplomacy, Anthropology, Climate and Conflict, CIENSPO has organized its annual collaboration with Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Science under its Kuwaiti program, a two-day conference that tackled issues like coronavirus, climate change, diplomatic urgencies and Middle East affairs, like in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon and Yemen. These panel sessions were held at the Industry Hotel in Paris capital.
The main subject that we discussed today was war and diplomacy, and I focused on the role of UN and Security Council and the role of diplomacy in targeting war and conflicts. I also talked about the solutions to our conflicts and that the only way is using preventive diplomacy to resolve conflicts.
This year's conference created a forum on how to generate solidarity for peace in an uncertain world by discussing the stakes of diplomacy, anthropology, climate and conflict and war. The ambassador of Kuwait mission to the United Nations, Mansour Al-Ataibi, has visited all the way from New York and said during the panels that diplomacy is the way to avoid war before the war even happens. The best thing that the international community did after World War is the formation of the United Nations, and it is the center of multilateralism, and it is the most important tool to solve crises all over the world. Al-Ataibi has shared his experience representing Kuwait at the UN in a critical time where he has taken steps to protect the guidelines and objectives of Kuwait's diplomacy all over the world.
We are participating in an 8-year-old collaboration between Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. This activity is one of the most important activities and falls under the agreement with the University of CIENSPO. Today, we discuss the importance of diplomacy in making peace and preventing war. And today's discussion has shown the role of NGOs by using preventative diplomacy to avoid conflicts globally.
There were guest speakers, among of them Vanessa Scherer, Vice President for International Affairs, Permanent Representative of the State of Kuwait, Mr. Mansour Al-Ataibi, and Peter Hurley, a colonel agent from the U.S. Army, as well as Enrico Letta, Dean of CIENSPO Paris School of International Affairs, and many other personalities from CIENSPO and Kuwait Embassy, including the Ambassador Sami Sleman and students of CIENSPO.
OPEC holds crunch talks with its allies after the group told Russia and others it wanted an additional 1.5 million barrels per day of oil cuts until the end of 2020, saying a big move was needed to deal with the impact of COVID-19. OPEC's proposal effectively presents an ultimatum to Moscow, which has so far been reluctant to back extra curbs on supply, even though oil prices have plunged more than 20% since the start of the year, trading below $50 a barrel. Saudi Arabia has been pushing for a big oil cut ahead of this week's talks in Vienna between OPEC, Russia, and other producers, a group known as OPEC+. 20 European Union member states agreed to take part in a joint procurement procedure to buy protective medical gear as part of the bloc's collective effort to fight COVID-19. The announcement was made after an emergency meeting of EU health ministers, during which officials sought in vain to persuade France, Germany, and other European countries to lift controls on the export of protective equipment. Speaking after the meeting, Italian Health Minister Roberto Speranza said a war between EU members over medical supply could lead to higher prices of protective gear, while Germany's Health Minister Jens Spahn said German restrictions on the export of masks, gloves, and suits were unlikely to target EU members. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an emergency spending bill for $8.3 billion to ramp up the nation's response to COVID-19, providing funds for state and local officials to combat the spread of the infections as the number of cases grows in the United States. The funding measure includes over $3 billion for research and development of vaccines, test kits, and medical treatments, $2.2 billion to aid public health activities on prevention, preparedness, and response, and $1.25 billion to help international efforts aimed at reining in the virus. Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar said there had been no violations of the ceasefire in Syria's Idlib as part of an agreement with Russia, while Russia said there have been a few shootings in the region. The ceasefire was reached in Moscow after talks to contain an escalating conflict. Akar also said Turkey would use its right to self-defense if there is an attack targeting its forces or bases in the region. The deal called for joint patrols of Turkish and Russian forces around the M4 road in Idlib region starting on March the 15th. Akar said Turkey has started to work on the procedures and principles of the safety corridor around the road, adding that a Russian military delegation will visit Ankara next week for discussions. At least 27 people were killed and 29 others wounded in a shooting attack that hit an assembly in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Chairman of the Afghan High Police Council, Karim Khalili, was delivering a speech when the shooting started, triggering the audience to look for shelter from bullets. Most of the politicians and government officials at the gathering, including Afghan government chief executive Abdullah Karim Khalili and former President Hamid Karzai, were unhurt and left the area safely. Tear gas and smoke bombs were fired across Turkey's border with Greece in a fresh flare-up in tensions over the presence of migrants seeking access to European Union territory. Reports said the projectiles were coming from Turkish territory and being fired towards Greek police over a high border fence near the Kastanis crossing. Volleys of tear gas was also exchanged on both sides. Earlier, Turkey announced that it would let migrants cross its border into Europe, saying it could no longer contain the hundreds of thousands and the prospect of a fresh influx because of intensified fighting in northwest Syria. Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte announced a stream of tough new measures to try to contain the COVID-19 outbreak that would impose a virtual lockdown on its wealthiest and most populous region. The new rules include telling people not to enter or leave Lombardy, which is home to some 10 million people, as well as a dozen provinces in 4 of Italy's 19 other regions. According to the decree, all museums, cultural centers, cinemas, and theaters will be shut in the targeted areas. All schools and universities will be closed in Lombardy and the 11 provinces affected until at least April the 3rd. The decree instructs citizens to absolutely avoid either entering or leaving the affected provinces, and even to avoid moving around other than for emergencies or essential work reasons within the designated areas. The Civil Protection Agency said the number of COVID-19 cases in Italy, Europe's worst-hit country, reached 5,883, the biggest daily rise since the pandemic began late last year. Egypt confirmed 33 new cases of COVID-19 on a River Nile cruise ship. Health Minister Hala Zayed said none of the new cases were showing symptoms of the virus. She added 12 suspected cases among the crew, 11 tested negative, but would nevertheless be quarantined for 2 weeks. Zayed also said the ship arrived in the southern Egyptian city of Luxor from Aswan, further upstream, and was towed to a position outside the city and placed under quarantine. She noted 171 people were on board the boat, including 101 passengers and 70 crew members. Of the 45 suspected cases from the boat announced over the past 2 days, 19 were foreign nationals. U.S. Democratic presidential candidates Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders are bracing for a showdown in Michigan, Missouri, and 4 other nominating contests next week, with Biden issuing a warning telling supporters in St. Louis not turn this primary into a campaign of negative attacks because that will only re-elect Donald Trump if we go that route. Sanders, who until recently was the front-runner in the party's race, to face Republican President Donald Trump in November, is now trailing in delegates and desperate to regain momentum after Biden received a rush of endorsements from party establishment figures following his strong Super Tuesday showing this week. Biden and Sanders will face off on Tuesday in Idaho, Mississippi, Missouri, Washington State, North Dakota, and Michigan. A big win for Biden in delegate-rich Michigan would deliver a major blow to Sanders' hope of becoming the nominee. On Saturday, Sanders begins a weekend of campaigning in the crucial battleground state of Michigan, which offers 125 of the 1,991 delegates needed to win the nomination. U.S. officials have told Sudan's Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok that removing his country from the list of state sponsors of terrorism is only a matter of time. The American delegation also stressed on lifting the financial and economic sanctions on Sudan. Moreover, Hamdok emphasized that the United States is a strategic partner for Sudan to overcome the challenges of the current stage. He also stressed on the keenness of the transition government to achieve peace and improve the economic situation. Sudan has taken a series of steps to remove its name from the American terrorist list in order to revive the Sudanese economy and open the door to foreign investment. AlSalam Society for Humanitarian and Charity Work organized 15,000 health baskets to distribute to families in need in fighting the spread of COVID-19. The health kits contain all the essential items that help the families to protect themselves from COVID-19, which include sanitizers, tissues, antibacterial cleaning products, and disposable gloves. Ghenwa Jabouri has more.
AlSalam Society for Humanitarian and Charity Work are no strangers to charity work and supporting those in need, especially during challenging and taxing times. One of the recent humanitarian initiatives the Society took is to prepare health kits to families across Kuwait to help them stay protected from COVID-19.
We have here eight healthy items for our basket. Okay, so we will start first. Here we have the anti-sanitizer. Okay, and also we have here soap. We have also here this gloves, and also we have here antibacterial wipes. Okay, so many things for the hands and for the body, for how to be ready for coronavirus, inshallah. Because of that, AlSalam, she will do all the best for it have to be her position here about what is happening here in Kuwait in this situation. So this is what we can do, and we hope we will do more for our country here in Kuwait.
The health kits contain all the essential items families are in need of to protect themselves from the coronavirus. Some of the items include sanitizers, tissues, hand gels, antibacterial cleaning products, disposable gloves, and disinfectant spray for the home.
I'm a volunteer in here. We're making health boxes with hand sanitizers, gloves, Dettol wipes, tissue boxes, and other things. I'm volunteering because I want to help people that are in need.
Playing a significant role during these difficult times and taking an important humanitarian initiatives, AlSalam Society will be going door to door to families across Kuwait and reach out to them to make them aware of the products in the health kit and inform them what they are for and how to use them.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan plans to be in Brussels for a one-day visit amid a charged conflict between Turkey and the European Union over migrants and refugees. Thousands of migrants headed for Turkey's land border with Greece after Erdogan's government said that it would no longer prevent migrants and refugees from crossing over to EU territory. Greece deployed riot police and border guards to repel people trying to enter the country from the sea or by land. The announcement came hours after European Union foreign ministers' meetings in Croatia criticized Turkey, saying it was using the migrants' desperation for political purposes. The cabinet has taken a series of measures to limit public gatherings to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The cabinet also extended closures of all educational institutions in the country for an additional 2 weeks, in addition to shutting down of cinemas, theaters, and wedding halls, as well as the suspension of all sports events until further notice. More in the following report by Dalal Al-Hajri.
In its weekly meeting yesterday, the cabinet has taken a series of measures to limit public gatherings to help stop the spread of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. The cabinet extended closures of all educational institutions in the country for additional 2 weeks, ending March 26, and ordered shutting down of cinemas, theaters, and wedding halls, as well as suspension of all sports events until further notice. In a statement following the meeting, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Interior and Minister of State for Cabinet Affairs, Anas Saleh, pointed out that the cabinet listened to a briefing from Minister of Health, Sheikh Dr. Bassel Sabah, and the cabinet has reviewed the recommendations presented by the Ministerial Committee spearheading the state efforts to counter the new coronavirus and decided the following. 1. Extended closure of all schools, universities, government and private colleges, and military colleges, and assigning the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Higher Education to prepare plans for dealing with future scenarios and repercussions of the current suspension, and to come up with alternatives to traditional educational process, tests, and procedures. 2. Instructing concerned authorities to close all cinemas and theaters as well as public and private wedding halls and ban setting up makeshift wedding reception tents until further notice. 3. Calling on sports federations to halt sports activities and friendly matches until further notice. 4. Assigning the Ministry of Interior in coordination with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Health to stop issuing all types of entry visas and confine visa issuing to the Kuwaiti diplomatic missions abroad. 5. Assigning the Ministry of Finance to allow the Ministry of Health to use the Kuwait International Fairground as a medical examination center. 6. Assigning the Kuwait municipality in coordination with the Ministry of Health to consider setting rules to funeral ceremonies to be in line with the health guidelines to control spread of infection. 7. Obliging all government agencies to make sure that Kuwaiti and non-Kuwaiti employees placed in quarantine or ordered to stay at home will not be allowed to go to work before the end of their quarantine period. The cabinet has also assigned the Ministry of Finance to prepare a draft law to allocate additional financial appropriations to cover the costs of the efforts to counter coronavirus. Furthermore, the cabinet has called on all citizens and residents to take all precautions and strictly adhere to the health instructions and guidelines that are constantly announced in all official media outlets in order to preserve their health and safety.
Incumbent Afghan President Mohammad Ashraf Ghani was sworn in for a second 5-year term. President Ghani issued the first presidential decree shortly after taking the oath, appointing Mohammed Yusuf Ghazanfar as the president's special envoy on development, economic, commercial, and alleviation of poverty affairs. During the ceremonies, which were held in the compound of the two palaces, several rocket shells landed outside the fortified buildings, causing panic among the attendees. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited residents who are quarantined at home at a community in Wuhan, the epicenter of the COVID-19 outbreak, following a stop at Hu Shenshan Hospital for epidemic prevention and control inspection. Xi, also General Secretary of the Communist Party of China's Central Committee and the Chairman of the Central Military Commission, learned about community-based efforts for epidemic prevention and control and ensured the people's daily necessities supply. He sent regards and expressed gratitude to community residents and frontline workers. In Italy, travelers had documents checked at Milan's central station as the country imposed an unprecedented lockdown to stem Europe's worst outbreak of COVID-19. The whole of Italy, Europe's worst affected country, is under lockdown until next month, in an unprecedented attempt to beat the pandemic. The measures announced by Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte widen steps already taken in the rich northern region of Lombardy and parts of neighboring provinces, restricting movement and banning public gatherings. Over 9,000 people have been infected in Italy in little over 2 weeks, out of a global total of more than 113,000 in over 100 countries. The Ministry of Health implemented its preventative measures in El Jon Resort after turning it into a quarantine center. It has received a number of citizens from Iraq infected with COVID-19. Hadil Fahed brings us more.
El Jon Resort has become ready since March 3rd to receive the incoming quarantined. Teams of the Ministry of Health, the National Guard, and the Ministry of the Interior are on standby and supervises the process of quarantine resort.
We received the peoples from the airport, and we kept them in their chalet and try to take also their medical history and their needs, requirements as much as we can. There is a good help from non-organizing resources like Jamiyat Tawaniya. All of these peoples, they are trying to help and providing us with everything that we need and extra we need.
In regard to the worldwide spread of the COVID-19, we are here in El Jon quarantine to minimize the risk of the spread of the virus. We're enforcing the importance of the collaboration of all the staff in such a situation, the administration, the medical, the nursing staff as well. And we're working hand in hand to make sure that all our guests here are provided with the best care.
The quarantine teams at El Jon Resort work 24 hours a day with the aim of providing the utmost protection and care to inmates until the end of their quarantine period.
In a continuation of the Super Tuesday turnout, Democratic voters in the United States turned out in droves for primaries in 6 states aimed at clearing up the question of who will go up against President Donald Trump in November, Bernie Sanders or the status quo candidate Joe Biden. Ultimately, Democratic voters opted for Biden, raising the question of whether Sanders will suspend his campaign. While the exact delegate counts will take days to tally, Biden won the popular vote in Michigan, Missouri, and Mississippi. Russia's State Duma proposed a constitutional amendment that would reset presidential term limits to 0, allowing Putin to run again for president in 2024, when his tenure is supposed to expire. Putin said the change would only go through if Russia's constitutional court approves it and if the public assents in the nationwide referendum on the amendments next month. President Vladimir Putin said in a speech to legislators, "When a country is going through such upheavals and such difficulties, stability may be more important and must be given priority." The amendment could keep Putin in power until 2036. Putin, who is now 67 years old, would be 84 years by the time his tenure ends. That's it for tonight. Join us again next week for more weekly news highlights.